Every 7 years, a date appears on the Hebrew calendar that has no equivalent in any other system of timekeeping on Earth, a date so precisely calibrated to the rhythm of economic renewal that the families who track it have used it to rebuild fortunes after every catastrophe history could invent, and the families who do not know it exists have watched their wealth erode in silence, wondering what invisible force keeps pulling the ground out from beneath them. This date is not celebrated in any church. It is not mentioned in any financial textbook. It is not printed on the calendar hanging in your kitchen. But it is coming. It arrives with the precision of a celestial mechanism that has not missed a single cycle in over 3,000 years, turning like a wheel set into motion at the beginning of creation itself. And when it arrives, it opens a doorway that remains open for exactly 12 months before sealing shut again. This knowledge survived the destruction of Solomon's temple. It survived the Babylonian captivity and the Roman siege that burned Jerusalem to ash. It survived the expulsion of every Jew from Spain in 1492, the pogroms of the Russian Pale, the ghettos, the camps, the decades of deliberate erasure that followed. It survived because certain families sewed it into the lining of their coats when they fled, because grandmothers whispered it to granddaughters in languages the authorities did not bother to learn, because rabbis memorized entire tractates of Talmud and carried them across borders in the only suitcase that cannot be confiscated, the human mind. And you were never told, not because you were unworthy, not because you lacked intelligence or devotion, because the institutions you trusted, the ones that claimed authority over your spiritual life and your financial life, decided that this particular piece of ancient knowledge was too dangerous to share with people who might actually use it. What I am about to tell you will change the way you understand every financial decision you have ever made, and the one you are about to make next will be different because of it. Stay with me. How many years did you work? I want you to hold that number in your mind. Not the career summary, not the resume version. The real number. The mornings you woke before the sun, because someone had to be first through the door, at the shop, the warehouse, the office, the clinic. The years you spent building something that was supposed to compound, supposed to grow, supposed to arrive at a destination that looked like security and felt like freedom. Do you remember the first time you understood that the math was not going to work the way they promised? Maybe it was the year the company folded your pension into something you could not pronounce. Maybe it was the afternoon you sat at your kitchen table with a calculator and realized that the house you paid 30 years of mortgage on was worth less, adjusted for what a dollar actually buys, than the day you signed the papers. Maybe it was quieter than that. Maybe it was just a feeling, a slow leak in the boat you had been rowing your entire adult life. You did everything they told you to do. You showed up early. You stayed late. You did not complain, because complaining was for people who did not understand the value of hard work. And you understood it better than anyone. You put children through school and did not ask them to pay you back. You skipped vacations for 5 years in a row so the money could go into the retirement account. You watched the price of gasoline double, watched the price of bread climb, watched the premium on your health insurance rise every January like a tide that never recedes. You watched younger people with half your experience earn twice your salary because they knew how to operate in a system whose rules changed when you were not looking. And underneath all of it, beneath the work and the discipline and the sacrifice, there was a question you carried like a stone in your pocket. You never asked it out loud because you did not know who to ask, and you were afraid the answer would confirm what you already suspected. The question was this: was there a rule I was never given? Was there a rhythm to this game that everyone else seemed to feel in their bones, while I was counting every beat by hand? I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it, not as comfort, not as flattery, but as diagnosis. It is not your fault. You were never taught the real rules. The real rules were encoded in a calendar that runs alongside yours, measuring time in a language you were never offered, and the families who understood that calendar did not work less than you. They worked inside a cycle you could not see. Some of them built dynasties. Some of them simply sustained their households in dignity across generations, while everything around them burned. But every one of them knew the date I am about to teach you. And now I must ask you the question that unlocks the rest of this teaching. What did they know that you were never told? My grandmother came to this country from a small town outside Fez, Morocco, in 1948. She was 31 years old, and she carried two things across the Atlantic. Her youngest daughter, my mother, wrapped in a wool blanket against the cold of the ship's lower deck, and a small leather-bound notebook written in Judeo-Arabic, the dialect that Sephardic Jews in North Africa used for private matters they did not want outsiders to read. That notebook contained dates, not birthdays, not anniversaries. Hebrew calendar dates, annotated with instructions. When to plant, when to harvest, when to lend, when to collect, when to release, when to be silent. I did not understand the notebook when I first held it as a boy of 11. Sitting in her kitchen in Brooklyn, a kitchen that smelled of cumin and olive oil and the particular sweetness of mint tea brewed in a pot so old the handle had been rewired with copper 3 times. She told me, "This notebook is older than me, older than my mother, older than her mother. It tells you when the doors open. Most people do not know there are doors." I remembered those words, but I did not understand them until decades later, after I had spent years in study, after I had sat in the small, cold study houses where the old rabbis of our community gathered to read texts that the modern synagogues had quietly removed from their shelves. And I want to tell you about the man who made me understand. His name was Martin Aldridge. He was 71 years old when he found me, or when the teaching found him. I am never sure which word is more accurate. Martin was a retired civil engineer in Raleigh, North Carolina. He had designed water treatment systems for the state for 34 years. His wife Carol was alive but diminished by early dementia, and Martin spent most of his days caring for her, measuring medications, preparing meals she sometimes did not recognize, washing dishes in a kitchen where the fluorescent light above the sink had been flickering for 2 years because he could not bring himself to care about fixing it. Martin had been raised Presbyterian. He had attended church every Sunday of his life until Carol's diagnosis, at which point he stopped, not out of anger at God, but out of a suspicion that the church had been giving him the container without the contents. A friend from his veterans group, a Jewish man named Saul, had given Martin a recording of one of my teachings. Martin listened to it 3 times in 1 week. Then he drove 4 hours to attend a gathering I held in a rented room above a bakery in Durham. After everyone had left, he sat in a metal folding chair and looked at me with the eyes of a man who had carried a question for 50 years and was afraid the answer would come too late. He said, "Rabbi, I keep hearing you talk about cycles, about timing. Is there really a date? A specific date? Because I have been making decisions my whole life based on a calendar that never told me when the doors were open." I sat down across from him. I poured him tea, and I told him what my grandmother told me, and what I am now telling you. The date is the first day of the Hebrew month of Tishrei in a Shemitah year. And understanding what that means requires you to hold 3 ideas at once, so listen carefully. The first idea is the Shemitah itself. In the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, the Torah commands, "At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release." The Hebrew word Shemitah comes from the root shin mem tet, and it means to let fall, to release, to let go of what your hands have been gripping. Every 7th year in the ancient Hebrew cycle was a Shemitah year, a year in which debts were forgiven, agricultural land was left fallow, and the entire economic system was reset to its original calibration. The rabbis of the Mishnah, writing in the academies of Tiberias and Yavne during the 2nd century of the Common Era, codified the laws of Shemitah in a tractate called Shevi'it, And they did so at enormous personal cost, because the Roman authorities viewed any independent Jewish legal system as a threat to imperial control. These rabbis were not writing agricultural advice. They were preserving the blueprint of an economic rhythm that predated every empire on earth. The Shemitah is not a metaphor, it is a structural feature of time. And the first day of Tishrei, the day called Rosh Hashanah, which means the head of the year, is the precise moment when the Shemitah cycle turns. This is the hinge on which the door swings. Now here is what this means for you. The Hebrew calendar operates in cycles of 7, and when the 7th year arrives, everything that has accumulated, every debt, every obligation, every pattern of holding and clenching and refusing to release, comes up for review. The families who understood this used the Shemitah year not as a year of loss, but as a year of recalibration. They released what was no longer productive. They forgave debts that were choking their relationships. They let the soil of their financial lives rest so that the next 6 years of planting would fall on renewed ground. Martin looked at me when I explained this, and he said, "Rabbi, are you telling me there is a year specifically designed for letting go?" And I said, "Not designed for it, commanded for it. Here is your first action. This week, before 7 days have passed, I want you to sit down with a piece of paper and write across the top the Hebrew word Shemitah. Below it, write a list of every financial obligation, every debt, every resentment connected to money that you are currently carrying. Do not solve anything on the list. Do not call anyone. Do not calculate payments. Simply write the list. Place it in an envelope and set the envelope on the highest shelf in your home, as close to the ceiling as you can reach. The rabbis teach that elevation is the direction of release. You are not ignoring these obligations. You are lifting them out of your hands and into a cycle larger than your own effort. Most people will refuse to do this because it feels like surrender. And that is precisely why they remain in the grip of a cycle they cannot see and cannot break. The second teaching connects directly to the first, because the Shemitah does not operate alone. It operates inside a larger architecture, and that architecture depends on a principle the Talmud calls bitachon, which is the Hebrew word for trust. Not trust in the way your financial advisor uses the word, not trust as in blind optimism, but trust as a structural act of alignment with the source of all sustenance. In Tractate Bereshot, Folio 35, Side B, preserved in the Academy of Surah in Babylonia during the 4th century, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai teaches that when Israel does the will of the Omnipresent, their work is done by others. The Talmud does not mean that they become idle. It means that when a person aligns with the divine rhythm, the effort they invest is multiplied by a force that has nothing to do with hours worked or strategies employed. Bitachon is the engine inside the Shemitah. The Shemitah tells you when to release. Bitachon tells you how to hold your heart while releasing. The word itself, bet tet chet vav nun, shares its root with the word for womb, beaten. This is not a coincidence. The rabbis understood that trust is a gestational act. When you trust, you are carrying something unseen, nurturing it in darkness, refusing to tear it open before its time. You are allowing the pregnancy of blessing to come to term. And the moment you panic, the moment you claw back what you released, you abort the process. Let me tell you what happened to Martin Aldridge 8 months after our conversation in Durham. He called me on a Wednesday morning, early, before 7. His voice was shaking, but not with fear, with wonder. He told me that he had written his Shemitah list. He had placed it on the top shelf of the hallway closet, next to a box of Carol's old photographs. And then he had done something I had not explicitly asked him to do, but which the teaching had moved him to do on his own. He had called his brother, a man named Richard, from whom he had been estranged for 11 years over a loan of $4,000 that was never repaid. Martin had called Richard and said 5 words, "I am releasing the debt." Richard had wept on the phone. They spoke for 2 hours. And 3 weeks later, without any connection Martin could trace through ordinary logic, a contract he had submitted for consulting work 2 years earlier, a contract he had assumed was dead, was suddenly approved. The amount was not $4,000. It was $14,000. I do not tell you this to promise you a return. I tell you this because the channel of sustenance, what the Zohar calls the Zinor Shel Parnassah, does not respond to strategy. It responds to release. Here is your second action. This week, identify one person from whom you are holding a debt, whether financial or emotional. It may be a sibling. It may be an old business partner. It may be a friend who borrowed something and never gave it back. Contact that person, by phone if possible, by letter if necessary, and say these words: I am releasing what you owe me. It is forgiven. You do not need to explain why. You do not need to reference this teaching. Simply release. And after you speak the words, whisper to yourself in Hebrew, Ani somech al Hashem. It means, I am leaning on God. I am trusting the source. Most people will hear this and say it is naive, that debts must be collected, that releasing is the behavior of fools. And those people will remain locked in a 6-year cycle that never reaches its 7th year, gripping coins that grow lighter in their hands with every passing season, wondering why abundance keeps circling their house, but never entering through the door. Now I come to the teaching my grandmother kept for the very end, the one she only spoke after the Shabbat candles had burned down to their bases, and the kitchen was dark, except for the light from the hallway. She would lower her voice, not because anyone was listening, but because certain words, she said, must be spoken softly, or they shatter. The principle is this: the Shemitah year does not only release the past, it plants the intention for the next 7 years, and that intention must be spoken aloud in specific words at the turning of the year, or the next cycle begins empty. The Hebrew concept here is called nedava, the voluntary offering of the heart. In the book of Shemot, Exodus, chapter 35, verse 21, the Torah describes the building of the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary in the wilderness, and it says that every person whose heart lifted them came forward with a nedava, a free will offering. The word comes from the root nun dalet bet, which means to be moved from within, to be impelled by an inner generosity that is not commanded, but arises naturally when a person is aligned with the sacred rhythm. The Zohar, in Parashat Terumah, teaches that the nedava is the seed that determines the harvest of the next Shemitah cycle. What you offer voluntarily at the turning of the year becomes the blueprint for what you will receive across the next 7 years. And this is the secret the Rothschild family and every enduring Jewish household has practiced in private for centuries. On the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the first night of Tishrei, they do not ask God for wealth. They offer something, not money, not ritual, but intention. They speak aloud what they are willing to become in the next 7 years. They declare it. They give voice to the future as though it already exists, because in the Hebrew understanding of time, the future does not arrive. It is spoken into being. Rabbi Akiva, the great sage of the 2nd century, who began as an illiterate shepherd and became the greatest teacher of his generation, who was eventually martyred by the Romans for the crime of teaching Torah in public, said in the Talmud, Tractate Makot, folio 24, everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is given. This is the paradox at the heart of the Shemitah. The cycle is fixed. The door opens on schedule. But what passes through the door depends entirely on what you bring to the threshold. The families who prosper across generations bring a nedava. They bring a spoken intention, loaded with kavana, directed intention of the heart, and they release it into the open channel at precisely the moment the cycle turns. The families who struggle bring nothing. They arrive at the threshold empty-handed, not because they have nothing to offer, but because no one ever told them the door was there. Let me tell you about a woman named Grace Chen, 63 years old, a retired hospital administrator in Portland, Oregon. Grace was not Jewish and not Christian. She had been raised in a secular household, the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who believed in education and silence. She had spent her 40s and 50s in various spiritual communities, yoga retreats, meditation circles, workshops on mindfulness, and had left all of them feeling the same quiet emptiness, the sense that she was being given techniques without roots, methods without memory. Grace found one of my teachings through a friend of a friend, and she wrote to me a letter that contained a sentence I have thought about every day since. She wrote, "Rabbi, I have spent 20 years learning how to breathe. No one ever taught me what to say while breathing. I invited Grace to observe the turning of the year with our small community. She came. She sat in the back, as visitors always do. And when the moment came, when the shofar sounded its ancient cry, the broken wail called the shevarim that mimics the sound of a heart cracking open, Grace wept. Not because she understood the theology, because she felt the door. She felt it in her body, in the center of her chest, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Afterward, she asked me what she should do. I told her, write your nedava. Write what you are offering to become, not what you want, what you will give. She wrote a single sentence on a card, and she placed it under the candle on her table at home, and she read it aloud every Friday night for a year. I will not tell you what she wrote. That is between her and the source. But I will tell you that 18 months later, Grace had begun teaching a small group of women in her community about the Hebrew calendar, about the rhythm of 7, about the SHEMITAH and the nedava, and for the first time in her adult life, she said she felt like she was part of something that did not begin with her and would not end with her. Here is your third action, and it is the most important one I will give you. Take a clean piece of paper. At the top, write the Hebrew word nedava. Below it, write one sentence that begins with the words, "In this next season, I offer myself as," and complete the sentence with what you are willing to become, not what you want to receive, what you are willing to give, to embody, to carry forward. Place this paper somewhere you will see it every day, beside your bed, on your bathroom mirror, under the candle you light on your day of rest, and read it aloud once a week. The Baal Shem Tov taught that a word spoken aloud is a vessel that ascends, and when it reaches the ear of the Holy One, it becomes a decree. Your nedava is not a wish, it is an architectural act. You are building the container for the next 7 years of your life. Most people will not write the nedava because they are embarrassed to declare what they want to become. They are afraid that speaking it aloud makes them accountable. And they are right. It does. That is exactly why it works. And that is exactly why the families who do it keep building, while the families who do not keep wondering what went wrong. Let me draw these 3 threads into one cord now, because they are not 3 separate teachings. They are the 3 movements of a single ancient engine. First, the SHEMITAH, the recognition that time moves in cycles of 7, that the 7th interval is sacred, and that what you release in the 7th year determines what grows in the next 6. Second, bitachon, the trust that holds you steady during the release, the gestational patience that refuses to tear open the seed before it sprouts, the willingness to lean on something larger than your own effort and your own arithmetic. Third, the nedava, the spoken offering that plants the intention for the next cycle, the declaration that transforms you from a passive recipient of whatever life delivers into an active architect of what the next 7 years will hold. These 3, release, trust, and offer, are the 3 turns of the key that opens the door the Hebrew calendar marks with such precision. And the reason this knowledge has been kept from you is not complicated. It is simply that the institutions that benefit from your ceaseless labor, from your anxiety, from your dependence on their calendars and their interest rates and their quarterly projections, Those institutions cannot survive a population that knows how to rest, how to release, and how to speak the future into existence. The rhythm of 7 is not a Jewish secret. It is a human birthright, encoded in the Torah, and offered to anyone who has the ears to hear it. God created in 6 days and rested on the 7th. The land was worked for 6 years and rested on the 7th. Debts were carried for 6 years and forgiven on the 7th. The Jubilee arrived after 7 times 7 years, and in the 50th year, everything returned to its original owner, every debt cleared, every ancestral inheritance restored. This is not economic theory. This is the architecture of time itself. And you are receiving it tonight, not because you stumbled upon it by accident, but because wisdom does not wander. It finds the ones it was meant to find. Your decades of struggle were not wasted. They were the 6 years of labor. The 7th is approaching, and the only question is whether you will arrive at the threshold with a nedava in your hand, or with empty palms and a heart full of the same exhaustion that has defined every cycle before this one. You already know the answer. You knew it before I spoke a word. That is why you are still here. 3 teachings, 3 actions, 3 words to carry with you past the edge of this moment and into the life that is waiting for you on the other side. Release, trust, offer. If something in you shifted tonight, if you felt the door even for an instant, even as a tremor in the chest, then I ask 2 things of you. First, write in the comments below a single sentence, not a reaction, a declaration. Write, I am entering the Shemitah of my life. Let those words be your first nedava, your first offering spoken aloud into the open channel, your first act of alignment with a rhythm that has sustained an entire people through every darkness the world could devise. Second, think of one person you know, one person who has worked their whole life with honest hands and a willing heart, and who still lies awake at 3 in the morning counting what they owe. Send this to that person, not to everyone, to that one. Hand to hand, the way wisdom has always traveled, the way my grandmother carried it from Fez, the way the rabbis of Surah carried it through the empire's collapse, the way it is being carried to you right now. The same God who marked the 7th day as holy before a single human being had drawn breath, who told Abraham to leave everything familiar and walk toward a land he would be shown, who sustained Naomi and Ruth through a season of loss so total that only faithfulness and grain kept them alive, that God knows your name, not your resume, not your credit score, your name, the one spoken over you before you were born, the one that will be spoken when the door opens and you finally walk through. You have waited long enough. The date is approaching, and now you know what to bring when it arrives. Release, trust, offer.